Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Neil Gyte is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out his first appearance on episode 695 of Boundless Body Radio. We also hosted him on an episode we released recently all about allulose, which is quite good as well. Neil Gyte's health journey began at a weight of 260 pounds when he was far from the active and fun father that he wanted to be, and he was clearly on a fast track to an early grave. This moment of clarity gave Neil a sense of determination to change and set him on a journey towards better physical and mental health, largely through ultra endurance training endeavors. Recently, observing the devastating impact of chronic diseases on his family and loved ones has led him to deep dive into research, searching for the root causes and exploring ways to manage and reverse these conditions. He and his brother recently decided to swim Lake Lomond, 22 miles long, with 0 calories to raise awareness for mental health, metabolic therapy, and chronic diseases. The purpose of the swim was to demonstrate the metabolic flexibility of our bodies to utilize fat as a fuel source, highlighting the potential of metabolic therapy as a natural lifestyle and a nutrition-based approach, which is proving to reverse and prevent many chronic diseases. Neil Gyte, what I'm so honored is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you very much, Casey. It's great to be back, as we agreed, off the back of the first episode, to do a post-swim analysis of how the swim challenge went. So
That's
super
right.
happy. Thanks for having me.
That's
Looking forward to the discussion.
Did my Americanism come out when I called it Lake Lomond rather than Loch Lomond? Like as soon as I
yes,
said
it
like,
did.
Oh, no.
And I was my mum and dad came up for the swim as well, which was really nice. I was being continually told by my dad to stop calling it a lake because I've just deferred to calling it as, the lake. And so he's like, no, it's a loch. So it's rubbing off.
Yep, that's fantastic. I was wondering whether we should spoil the secret in the beginning or wait until we get more of the story to say that you successfully completed the swim or not. It was kind of inferred in the introduction that you did complete it. So I guess we'll get the spoiler alert out of the way. First of all, were you able to complete the swim?
So first of all, yes, so we both completed and finished the swim. I did the swim as certainly I planned. So totally fasted, 0 calories. I think one of the coolest moments. There were a lot of cool moments during the day, but when I finished the swim, I stopped my watch and just quickly looked at the summary stats and realized I'd burnt 9,632 calories.
Wow.
And I was fasted for 27 hours, just consuming water and electrolytes. That was very cool. So yes, I completed the swim as planned. My brother in the end decided not to do it fasted. His training hadn't really gone to plan. He's got 2 young kids, family commitments, and other things. And the swim for him has always been kind of a dream swim for the last 5 years. It's something he's always wanted to achieve. So we always agreed that for him, completing the swim was most important, and he just needed to eliminate some variables. So he didn't do it fasted. I did, but we both still did it together and completed it together. So it was, it was a pretty epic and special day all around.
Well, I can't wait to hear about the preparation for the swim since we last talked. I can't wait to hear about that actual day itself. You posted all your updates on the website, which is really cool to see the pictures and it looked like it was a beautiful yet maybe cool kind of day. But before we do, if you don't mind, will you remind us how it was that you found metabolic health, and also how you and your brother decided to even attempt this as kind of a concept?
Yeah, of course. So my journey into metabolic health really started, as you mentioned in the intro, with my own kind of health journey. So from being very overweight and just very unfit, I started to run, swim, bike a little. I signed up for my first triathlon, and before I knew it, I was down the slippery slope into ultra endurance endeavors. So through that, energy utilization and energy systems was always really interesting to me. And actually, a lot of my earlier events, because my coach at the time was very much low carb keto, I got kind of introduced into metabolic health, flexibility, really from a fuel source perspective. So that has been generally consistent in my life for most of the last 10 years. I've played around with pretty much every different approach, but it really was the impact of chronic diseases, autoimmune diseases, cancer, bipolar, depression on family and loved ones that made me really fundamentally understand the importance of our mitochondria, and that looking after them and optimizing for them to be able to create energy is the root cause of all of these chronic diseases, or at least 90% of them. So that prompted me to set a new North Star vision to help 1 billion+ people to become metabolically healthy, because so much of the world still doesn't, realize how important metabolic and mitochondrial health is. How that played into the swim was my brother was struggling with mental health and depression back 5 years ago, and on a family holiday, we managed to get him to agree to go for an open water swim, which from his perspective, just he said it was like the fog lifted from his depression for about 24 hours. And he's not quite sure exactly what, but a mixture of the cold water, being outdoors, and just exercise transformed his mental state. But it only lasted for 24 hours. And then, the kind of the fog descended back down. So he made outdoor swimming kind of a passion and started doing longer and longer things. And actually, his first swim was a 10K swim in Loch Lomond. And that, for him, 5 years ago, set there, I want to swim the whole length of Loch Lomond. So that really started the swim. So he agreed to himself and decided to do the swim. He then asked me to join because I've done a lot of ultra endurance stuff. And at the time, I was switching really to metabolic health and awareness. And so I then said, well, why don't we do it with a little twist of doing the 0 calories to really demonstrate that the body can happily fuel athletic endeavor based on fat, and that carbohydrates and sugar are not necessary. Yes, they can be additive, but they're not necessary for athletic endeavor. And so that's how 0 to Lomond was kind of born as a concept.
Amazing. And so you and I talked last time about your preparations and how you were training. You did have a run-in with law authority. I believe it was in California for swimming in a place you shouldn't have.
Supposedly, yeah, in one of the lakes in California. That was a fun one. Got pulled out after and a lift home after an hour.
How did the rest of your training go after that?
Yeah, so after that, the rest of the training went I would say went pretty well, in that I, at least from a distance and endurance perspective, so most of my training was then pool based, which wasn't ideal for open water, cold water conditions, but it had to work with what I had. So it's mostly pool based, and it was a mixture of, doing long fat fueled and fasted sessions with, shorter strength and quite a lot of strength work, actually, because a lot of my previous ultra endurance stuff was Ironman, and running based, so very much leg based, and the swim is very much upper body based. So I would say I definitely felt a little bit undertrained where I would like to be, but I managed to complete at least kind of the big milestones for me, which is any ultra endurance event. If you can complete 80% of the distance as part of a kind of a training simulation, then I think that gives you huge confidence. So it was about a month ahead of the swim. I did a 30-kilometer pool swim, totally fasted. So I woke up in the morning, literally got in the car, went down to the pool at 6:30, didn't get home till 5:30, and was just swimming laps in the pool for 9.5 hours, just taking water and electrolytes. And actually that felt amazingly great, in that I actually felt myself getting stronger and stronger throughout the swim. So I would say that was the biggest landmark in terms of the training, that the confidence of, yes, not only is it possible, but the body seems to be thriving and in a state of kind of homeostasis, doing that. So then on top of that, the unknowns going into the challenge were the open water, the cold weather, and the cold water, I should say, and adapting to all of the other gear. So yeah, I can happily talk through some of that. So, but that really gave me the confidence booster to know that I had, at least enough to be able to, complete the swim. Then it's really down to the elements and the mindset on challenge day.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, so every time I've got an athlete who does an event, we'll always, give it about a week or so, and then I'll ask, a series of questions about like recapping, how everything went. And I'll try to separate it at first into like what things could you control and what things could you not control. And then say like what's one thing that you're like very proud of that went really well, and what's one thing that was in your control that also didn't go as planned that you would like to change if you were to do this thing again.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's dig into all of that. I think it's really interesting to look at, yeah, as you say, the qualitative nature as well as some of the quantitative and data nature of it. So yeah, I'll have to start wherever you deem fit.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's work up to the day itself. So you had to get there. You had to travel, obviously, from here to Scotland, and yeah, you're dealing with a lot of kind of variables and different things. So I'm assuming that it wasn't an exact date that you had to get this done logistically. There must have been a range of dates, right? Just waiting for like the best weather.
Yeah, exactly. So we had a 3 day swim window to give us maximum chances of best weather. And that's the biggest thing out of our control was which day and what's the weather going to be like. So that was certainly an element of uncertainty that, previously all the races I've done have all been organized on a very specific day. So that was interesting. Thankfully, the weather gods were incredibly kind to us in that an area of high pressure kind of came across Scotland just at the right time. So we ended up having beautiful, actually amazing conditions. They couldn't have been any better. At the same time, we actually only made the decision about when to do the swim on the Wednesday afternoon, and the call was for the Thursday morning because the forecast was good actually across all 3 days, but we were looking for the optimal day. And initially, the organizer of our safety boat thought that Saturday might be better, whereas myself and my brother, looking at all the different forecasts, thought that the Thursday would be better. So there was this, as the forecast changed a little bit. So that was a little bit crazy that we were kind of set for Thursday. At the same time, we didn't know until kind of late Wednesday afternoon. And then when we made the call, it was like, oh, the swim challenge is tomorrow. So that was a really interesting, part of this concept of not being able to truly kind of lock in and having to be prepared for it to be that Thursday and actually any weather conditions. But thankfully, the conditions were absolutely amazing. So.
Yeah, from the picture, it's obviously really early, right before you guys went. But the picture from the morning, the lock looked like absolute glass. So it looked like the weather, as far as that went, was fantastic.
So it really was, we started that first hour was just serene because we started just in darkness and then sunrise came kind of over the mountains surrounding Loch Lomond, and it was glass flat at the start, pretty much glass flat at the finish. Got a little, it wasn't even choppy. We didn't even notice the waves throughout. And so really we couldn't ask for any better conditions. They were, at least from a weather perspective. The water was pretty cold, so it was 12 degrees Celsius, which is what, about 54 Fahrenheit. So, and that was back to the inside outside of control. Really, the conditions and the temperature is outside of your control. So, to mitigate against that, we did actually go to Loch Lomond. It was about 4 or 5 days. So I flew overnight on the Friday, Saturday, and then went straight up to Loch Lomond, met my brother there. So we did a couple of days of testing different gear and some practice swims to get familiar with the environment, and did a couple of just kind of lake dips in our skins to connect. And that for me is always an interesting one, because I think if you prepare the body for kind of extreme cold without a wetsuit, then I think it adapts better with a wetsuit. So we did a bunch of different things like that to try and at least get the body and mind prepared, but also connected to the water, the lake, because especially for my brother, it was a bit more of an emotional, spiritual journey for him that I was trying to, I would say, tap into. I think that's a really important part, to try and connect with the nature, because ultimately, yeah, we were, planning to swim the lake, but it's just, I think, important to
Love that.
connect with the nature as well.
Yeah, I love that. It looked like you guys were doing some breathwork sessions in some of those early days. And so I think that's a great thing to feel connected to the location that you were at. One
Yeah.
challenge that you told me about offline was not just the travel itself, but also, kind of getting readjusted to different time zones. And, going from, Houston to London is not a huge jump. It's not like going to, Calcutta or something halfway around the world, but you had a huge challenge as far as your sleep quality went, right?
Yeah, I really did. And I mean, I've traveled extensively over the last 20 years, both for work and events. And so generally, I've coped with jet lag and time differences pretty well. This time, yeah, it was just really strange. I just couldn't get good quality sleep. And so I was able to fall asleep, but I was just waking up a lot. My sleep quality was horrendous. So if I look at my Garmin sleep scores, I think maybe I had, of the six sleeps that I had in the UK before the challenge day, I think five of those six were scores, below 55, which is pretty terrible on the sleep
Wow.
score. I think I had one in kind of the mid 70s. So I had one decent night's sleep in the mid 70s. And the night before, it was actually quite a warm day the day before the challenge. And the Airbnb we were staying, no air conditioning. It did have a fan, but it was just really hot and uncomfortable. And sometimes the night sleep before challenge can be kind of tricky anyway. So I just had a really horrific kind of night's sleep, especially the night before. But back to what's in your control and out of your control, I tried all the techniques to try and get myself to sleep, but ultimately when challenge day comes, and I never check any of the data. All of this was looking retrospectively. I didn't look at my sleep scores at all, whilst I was there, because I just find it, yeah, when you know it's bad, you're better kind of not to know.
Yeah, totally.
But that was it was a real underlying challenge, maybe to dig a little bit into some of the data. So, I noticed as I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor provided by Levels, because we're going to do a video specifically for Levels around what was happening with my glucose levels and my metabolism, throughout the swim. But that was fascinating, because in the US, before I traveled, I could see my average glucose levels were, around 85 to 90. But the kind of 5-6 days building up to the event, that shot up to, kind of over 100 on average, which, being on a very low carb diet, everything else stayed the same, just gives an impact as to how important, sleep and stress is in the body. Even if I didn't particularly feel stressed about the event, because I wasn't, the training swims we had, actually, that 2-hour training swim on the Sunday was probably one of my most favorite moments of the trip before the challenge, because I'd done all my training in the pool. I'd put all the gear on. I was outside in this great environment. I was feeling relatively fresh then, only a couple of, nights sleep kind of deprivation. And so, yeah, from that perspective, I felt great. But outside of that, my glucose kind of level and body clearly was, feeling the stress of not sleeping properly. So that it was pretty significant undercurrent, actually, yeah, to the whole challenge, and just, my 12 days that I had in the UK.
That's fascinating insight about the blood sugar. It's something that we talk about all the time with stress and sleep and whatever, but to have quantitative measures and to see that, yeah, it's not catastrophic to have your blood sugar lingering around 100, but it's not great, especially long term. And to have that on a low carbohydrate diet really does show the quantification of what that can do internally.
Yeah. So maybe one other thing I can share around this. So I literally just got my blood labs back this morning, so I haven't managed to go through them in a significant amount of detail. So Cyfox very kindly gave me 4 different kits. So I did one around 10 days before the swim. I did one the morning of the swim, one the morning after the swim, and I did one just a few days ago as a kind of a post swim. So actually, one of the fascinating things which correlates to this that I noticed, which really surprised me, was, if I just have a look now, my fasting insulin levels. And again, being very low carb, you would expect those to be pretty good, and they generally were. So they were back in on September the 12th. They were around 2, which is, pretty good for fasting
Oh,
insulin.
yeah.
The day before, the morning of the swim, this is so before I'd done any swimming, and that was a relatively, I'd done a couple of practice swims, but other than that, we were making sure we were fresh for challenge day. My fasting insulin jumped to the September to 18th up to 6.5. And so that's just another, again, even though I was very low carb throughout the 4 or 5 days, specifically because I wanted to go into the swim carb depleted as part of the metabolic, kind of challenge. So yeah, it's just another fascinating insight into just truly the impact of sleep and stress on the body. So that, I would say, it surprised me just how significant the fasting insulin jump was, but it makes sense when you understand the body's physiology and kind of how it metabolizes, stress as well as food and all of the other important things that go into metabolic health.
Fascinating. Yeah, I just think it's so cool that the numbers match up with what we would consider like the observation, but also the mechanism, right? Like if stress were to affect you in a certain way, then all the things you just said would make a lot of sense as far as like blood sugar and blood insulin. Speaking of food, so what foods were you eating? Did you change your diet drastically when you were over there? Or were you eating primarily low carbohydrate, kind of the same basic foods?
Yeah, no, so I've specifically kept my diet very, very stable, because that was part of the kind of metabolic demonstration, was to try and keep everything the same. So still the same. So, very low carb Mediterranean, a mixture of, kind of nice ribeye steaks. Actually got some great, nice fatty fish. So some mackerel, some, tuna, avocados. So, nice healthy olive oil, macadamia nuts. Keto bricks were actually a staple part of just helping me to keep consistent, which I use for training as well as throughout. So yeah, I really, my carbohydrate intake for, I would say, the couple of weeks building up to it was really, less than 20 grams of carbs per day, really specifically keeping that low, high healthy fat, moderate protein to provide a consistent baseline in, because what I didn't want to do, and some people asked, are you going to, eat a ton of food and carb load before the event? And that for me would detract from the metabolic nature of it, because even if you're fat adapted, if you then, have, 2,000 calories of carbohydrates the day before, then your body obviously sinks that into the muscles. So you do have carbohydrates on hand. And for me, really, the purpose was to demonstrate that you don't need to. Your body will happily produce the amount of glucose that you need through gluconeogenesis and will happily burn fat as fuel. So for all those reasons, yeah, I kept pretty strict on the nutrition afterwards as well. So I also did some microbiome tests before and afterwards. I'm still waiting to the results of those back, but keeping the diet as consistent as possible really helps to tease apart what differences were due to the swim, but also back to what we mentioned earlier, what also, could be induced by really stress on the body of lack of sleep. And that's why I think it's interesting to have, the before and after, so I can start to tease apart, which of those trends were most likely sleep and stress related versus which were exercise and physiology driven.
I'm glad you mentioned the carbo loading. I was actually going to ask you about that. It's funny to contemplate, but that could have wrecked the whole thing. Like if that would have put you in a carbohydrate fed kind of carb burning kind of a state for your swim, if you wouldn't have been able to bounce back into a very high fat oxidation, and you would have bonked. There's no way you could have done the swim if you had potentially could not have completed the swim on no calories because you were fat, because you were eating your normal foods. It's funny to wonder what would have happened if you would have had like a big old plate of pasta or whatever, like we're told to do before our sporting events as kids.
Yeah. So it did cross my mind that it's back to, oh, well, maybe I need to do the swim again to test it with a slightly different set of variables. So my hypothesis on this is maybe a little bit different to yours in that given the training buildup, I do think that I'm fat adapted enough that having a significant amount of carbohydrates the day before, my body would have burnt off that glucose first. It would have just taken me longer to get into a ketogenic state. But I do think that then if you look at my kind of my CGM data, which largely, starts off and then after about kind of 5 or 6 hours, it drops down to my kind of gluconeogenesis base. So I think that would have just dropped down much more slowly as I would have burnt through those carbs. So, but I think if you tried to obviously do this not fat adapted, then I do think that you would, but if the body's not familiar of switching over into that fat burning, then I do think that people would bonk, the body shuts down because it simply just, it can't switch to that fat burning source. So, it would be interesting to rerun it again and do low carb throughout the whole training. And then, add carbohydrates the day before to see what impact, that would have. That's my suspicion, but we'll only know if I, dare to go and swim 22 miles again.
That's well, it already sounded a little miserable. But to do that, a carbohydrate fed sounds really miserable. But that's a fair point. I appreciate that. Before every event, it always seems like something goes wrong, unexpected, again, outside of your control. You charge up your favorite playlist on your iPod and it dies the day before or whatever. Something happens, right? Besides the sleep, was there anything significant that kind of went wrong? Like any issues with any of the equipment, or was everything pretty much smooth sailing because you were like testing everything before the event?
Yeah, so most of it was smooth sailing. And the biggest learning that we had was really for my brother. So the two training swims that we did, the first one for 2 hours, I felt absolutely great as part of that. My brother really struggled with the cold. And so to the point about an hour into the first training session, he was, visibly shivering. And so we got to the end of that, and he honestly, he was looking at thinking, how am I going to survive for 12 hours, in this? But we managed to figure out that it was his gear. So he had a different head kind of gear from me, which just wasn't as protective to the head. And obviously you lose the most amount of heat from your head. So then the following morning I said, look, I'll give you my headgear. Let's switch. And I then added another hat on top of his. And he was much better that second day. He also actually wore two wetsuits to mitigate against the cold, which actually had some unexpected benefits, which I'll come into which in a minute. So really, back to the nature of any event, you've got to be trained, but you've also got to, go do the course recce and make sure that you're prepared for the conditions. I think we did absolutely, I would say, as much as we could there to kind of plan and prepare. So honestly, on challenge day, there weren't too many things that went wrong specifically. Like a minor thing for me, we were staying in the Airbnb. I accidentally left my heart rate chest strap monitor in the Airbnb. So I didn't end up having that for race day, which was a little bit annoying because it is a bit more accurate than I would say than the watch on the wrist. But at least I still had that as a backup. So that wasn't a major thing. For me, the biggest two things actually that impacted me on race day outside of my control, or a little bit inside. The first one there was a sleep thing. So, and I'll come to that maybe second. The funniest one was actually I made a specific decision after 3 hours to change my gear because we had these protective mitts that my brother kind of bought online and we tested before that are kind of totally waterproof. So they really protect your hands and they were actually pretty cool. But just when I was doing the practice swim, I like the feel of kind of water between my fingers. And so it was a little bit weird swimming with these mitts on. So I wasn't kind of sure whether I should keep them on, but cold is the number one thing that obviously stops you in any of these endurance events. So I started swimming with these mitts. But into the second hour, I started to get water coming into the mitts, which I was trying to figure out, like, why is water getting in? Because, we had boots on, we had a hat on, so there shouldn't have been any water, getting in. And obviously, I then realized, well, I am hydrating with water and electrolytes, and obviously I'm then peeing in my wetsuit, and that was starting to get into my mitts. And so through the second hour, and then, water is actually pretty heavy. So by the third hour, more and more was coming in. And it was actually like swimming with a dumbbell in each arm, because you think about every single stroke,
Goodness.
you're having to lift your arm up. And I was having to do that and these mitts are pretty decent size, like it's a decent amount of water in. So in the third hour, I was there thinking, I was like, I probably could do this for another 9 hours, but my arms are starting to, feel this a little bit. And yeah, so I took the decision after the third hour to take the mitts off, and then I just had a very thin layer of gloves underneath. And my hands got a little bit cold, like never crazy cold, but that was, I would say, the biggest right decision that I got right to take those off, because that fourth hour just felt, oh, my arms, felt like they were flying again, because it's like going to the gym and doing, exercises with heavy dumbbells, and then you pick up a light dumbbell and you're like, oh, it's totally different. So
Of course.
I would say, so that for me, that was the biggest decision I think I made on challenge day that just impacted, my ability to do and complete the challenge. But I would say the constant thing for me, and I did thoroughly enjoy the day. I really did, especially the first few hours, how beautiful it was, and towards the end. But the lack of sleep, I think, did have an impact on me in terms of how I was feeling throughout the swim. So when I did my 30K training swim, totally fasted, obviously different conditions, right, in a pool, not outdoors. But I think a lot of it was I was well slept going into that. I got stronger throughout, and I actually got faster throughout. And I felt like I had, have different gears. So, you start off in first and second gear, and you can ramp up the gears. On challenge day, as much as I tried to, dial into those different gears, I just had one gear for the whole day, and that was just, kind of, and even that was a little bit more of a grind than I thought it would be. And I think a lot of that was down to the stress in the body and the sleep deprivation, leading up to it. So that was another interesting learning. But it's also back to the beauty of these kind of challenge events, which is there's always something that kind of comes up a cropper. And I was prepared for crazy weather conditions, the rain, and all the rest of it. And so mentally, you always go in and say, it doesn't matter what happens, it's about completing the challenge and doing so safely, which I did. But it definitely, I would just say, it wasn't quite as enjoyable as throughout as I thought it might be, given that as a context. But that happens during ultra
Sure.
endurance events.
Yeah, yeah. You told me that stands out from our conversation before. You told me that that was a priority of yours to just make sure, if nothing else, you're enjoying the day, you're looking around and kind of soaking it in. These things, they're so long. It's all day, but it's just a day. Like you look back on it, it's just over and done before you know it. And you spend all this time thinking you're like suffering through, and to an extent you are, but also it's over and done in the blink of an eye. And you realize, like, oh, I just let that whole event pass without like appreciating all my training and all that stuff. And I did want to ask, I want to point this out. This was not obvious to me. Maybe it's obvious to the listener, but when I started training for that triathlon that I did when I was doing swimming, I really underestimated the difference between swimming in a pool versus swimming in open water. And you've talked about pool swimming and open water swimming as two distinct things. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference and the challenges of those two things?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, so they're two very different things, I think, for a couple of reasons, really. The first thing is obviously conditions, temperature, and so forth. You're wearing a wetsuit, most likely in outdoor conditions, you're not in a pool. And that wetsuit helps in some regard in that you do get a bit of a buoyancy from it. At the same time, they're actually pretty amazingly designed these days. And Sailfish was really kind to send both of us actually top of the line, wetsuits, which was a huge thanks. So big shout out to Dennis and the team at Sailfish. They were really, really great. I think the other thing really is outdoor swimming is you're constantly having to look ahead and sight. So, we didn't want to be meandering back and forth and making the 30-kilometer swim, 40 kilometers. So, and I actually, when I was doing my pool training, I did simulate this. So, every, I don't know, 10 lengths or so, I would purposely swim a little bit with your head elevated, but that puts a different stress, certainly on the shoulders and arms as you're, browsing your eyes above the water to have a look and see, to make sure you're sighting, in the right direction. So it changes that, I would say, a little bit, but also then you don't have, the flip turns, which are a good, core muscle workout, but it is very different swimming outdoors. Cold really is the biggest thing, and so having the right gear can certainly help against that. I would love actually at some point in the future to truly, because I do think, I'm a big advocate of Wim Hof. Not only is breathing is cold therapy, I do think if you train the body and you get that brown fat to be able to activate that, you can also do amazing things in cold water without, protection. But for me, the build up to the swim, living in Houston and just not having those conditions, I did do a couple of ice baths actually in the lead up to it to just to get the body, used to being cold and then kind of exercising cold. But yeah, I would say they're the main differences between pool and outdoor
Yeah,
swimming.
got it. For me, on that swim that I told you did not go very well for me, my heart rate was all the way up in the 190s when I got out of the swim. It was really psychological because you think when you're in a pool that it doesn't matter that much, but looking straight down and seeing a line and understanding that it's 4 feet deep, like you can stop and walk anytime if you want, versus peering down and it's just an abyss. And like these wetsuits are amazingly designed. You're right. Like they're thinner around the shoulders. They're a little bit thinner around the chest. They're thicker by your lower body. So that gives you that kind of buoyance that you were talking about. It kind of lifts you up a little bit, but it's also, there is an element that it's like a little bit tight to your chest. And for me, again, like not seeing the line, being in the dark, trying to figure out how to sight, and you start to panic and then you get into like real trouble. And that wetsuit feels like it's way tighter than it was when you started. So there are challenges there. But yeah, certainly harder open water than pool swimming.
Yeah, so look, they're really, really important points actually. So I would caveat that both my brother and I are pretty experienced swimmers in that we did a lot of swimming when we were younger. So the technique, but we've also we've done enough outdoor swimming, and I've done a whole bunch of different triathlons where you get used to doing that. But I agree actually, and actually some of my early triathlons were a little bit similar, especially when you've got everybody starting at the same time, and it is a thankfully now these days with half Ironmans and Ironmans, they stagger it out. But when everyone was starting at the same time, you literally have to like sprint to get out the front. Otherwise, you're getting a foot, kicking you in the
Yeah.
face and your goggles going awry. So yeah, your heart rate jumps all the way up. And then on top of that, as you say, you do have all of these other, elements. Thankfully, it was in a lake as well. So I did watch Jaws a little bit too young as a kid. So
Me
sea,
too.
sea swims. So actually back to my training. So when I got pulled out by the police in that lake in LA, the next morning I went down to Venice Beach and did a sea swim there. And that was a very therapeutic session because the first hour for that, even though, it's rare that you get any sharks around there, but you're still, as you say, you're in the darkness of the ocean, you're staring down and the mind starts to play, funny different tricks from you. But after an hour of that, you just come to the realization that, look, if now is my time and the shark happens to come along and decide it wants to have a little bite of my leg, there's nothing I can do about that. Am I going to get out of the, of the water and forsake my training in the swim, and so you just make peace,
Yeah.
with it. So,
Yeah.
but no, but I would say the open water swimming as part of events, especially the cold water, can have that physiological kind of fight or flight impact on the body, which really can, as you say, because once you get in that state, it's really difficult when you're in the open water to calm the body down.
Yeah. Okay. Another ignorant American question: were any Loch monsters sighted on your swim? Speaking of sharks.
So no Loch
Okay.
monsters
Okay.
sighted. So obviously Loch Ness, one of the
Yep.
other
Yep.
lakes there, has the infamous Nessie. But yeah, there were no
Okay. Good.
no sights of any monsters in Loch Lomond,
Excellent. Okay.
unfortunately.
You're good to hear. During the day, did you feel like everything was fairly even? Spirits, pace, consistency, presence, or did you notice significant like high points, low points? Any times you thought like maybe you weren't going to be able to make it, you needed to quit, anything along those lines, or did everything feel like it was fairly even?
So I'd say everything was generally fairly even, but even to tie this back to the comment earlier, even in terms of I could really tell even from the first second hour that I was going to have to just tough it out because I rarely got into kind of that flow state. Maybe in the fourth hour, I think as my ketones really started to bump up and as I lost my extra weight from the mitts, the fourth hour was probably where I felt at my best. But then beyond that, I just didn't have the extra gears, and so it was really about I would say just toughing it out in that every stroke really from then on kind of felt like I just wasn't truly in the flow state that I'd gotten into in some of the long training swims. So from that perspective, and that was an interesting mindset then to be in for the next kind of 6 7 8 hours. And back to your point, you try to focus on the positives as much as you can, all of the training that set you up, all of the amazing support, the reasons why you're doing it, which for me obviously were pretty true and important. At the same time, it's really difficult to stop your mind going to those dark places of why did you decide to do this? What are you doing? You've got, this for another 6 hours, and you do battle, back and forth between those. But I would say for me, kind of the way I approach a lot of these, things through ultra endurance events, and I've had, definitely more challenging times through Ironmans that I've done, especially the run at the end of an Ironman is just something else. It's just back to, you reset, you focus on the next stroke, you focus on the next stroke, and you kind of, try to replace that negativity when it arises, with positivity. And through that, then you just keep going through each stroke and, even counting. So kind of one of my favorite things, sometimes the mind wanders in amazing ways and you get these really expansive moments, which is great. Other times, literally, I would just count my strokes up to 1,000 to past 10, 15 minutes because you're just going through a little bit more of a rough patch and you just kind of, need to keep moving. To answer your final question, no, I would say there was never a point where I thought I wasn't gonna do this because I think mentality on challenge day is one of the most important things, and that singularly focus on having to complete it, obviously barring anything, safety, if there was any threat, or if I felt that I was doing myself significant damage. And so it was always just a case of how long is it, how long is it going to take? But we actually kept pretty steady pace actually throughout it. I was having a look at the pacing chart. We maybe started off a little bit faster and then, slowed a touch, but the pacing was actually pretty consistent. The heart rate generally was pretty consistent. And my CGM data, which maybe we can come to a little bit, I thought was actually was some fascinating insights into what the body's doing from a glucose perspective as well.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely want to hear about some of that data. You guys finished, were you together pretty much the whole time and finished at the same time? What was the time of the swim?
Yeah, so the official time I think was about 11 hours 55 minutes. We did it in just under 12 hours, which was pretty good. We were targeting, I would say 12, but 12 to 14, taking into account conditions and other things that might happen. And yeah, we finished it together. We swam the whole thing together. I would say we were probably maybe 10 meters apart at the largest part, but that was also a little bit sometimes because it's nice to swim a little bit on your own. We obviously had the safety boat with us, and so sometimes it was nice just to kind of be in the water and feel like you were on their own, but we were always pretty close. So yeah, it was great. We had a nice hug to start, and we finished it together. I had a good hug at the finish line. So and that was a really nice undercurrent. My older brother was in the boat as part of the safety crew, and
Cool.
mum and dad drove up obviously for the event. So they, we saw them in the morning before we left, and they were there to greet us at the finish. So
That's cool.
yeah, it was a really nice family moments around the swim.
That's cool. And since this is the longest loch in Scotland, this would be like a standardized swim, right? There must be like benchmark times or ranges so you could kind of compare like your times with like whatever the average was. So that's cool. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think so Chris and the Inchbaggers team who did our safety, so they support, lots of people who try and do the swim. So obviously people have done it, faster than us. But I think we were to, I would say, to the faster end of that. I would say of kind of that. So generally 12 to 16 hours is kind of the range. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the record is for the fastest. I'll ask Chris actually what the fastest Loch Lomond. So maybe we go back at some point and try and do it fasted and
Cool.
beat the fastest time. But I'm getting ahead of myself now.
So it's also interesting what I yeah, I'm not sure how you're going to answer. I have my hunch, but like when you do things fasted and you're used to doing them fasted, you would think you would have been starving by the end of the swim and you wanted food right then. Were you starving when you finished the swim?
No, not
Yeah.
at all.
Yep.
And I think it's back to the metabolic state that the body is in, where your body is in, even though I would say not struggled, but even though I wasn't quite on an even keel going into the swim, still the body got into a level of homeostasis and ramped up the ketone production. And when it does that, it's like, well, I've got sufficient fuel. I'm happy to keep on going. And really, the hunger comes from your body saying, yeah, I'm in an energy imbalance, or I've got something that's going on, or you're triggering some survival instinct that effectively says, I need to eat. So no, honestly, after the swim, I could quite happily have not eaten. I didn't really feel hungry. I did eat after the swim for two reasons. One, I had some really great sponsors of the swim in terms of RX Sugar, House of Macadamia's, Keto Brick, that had really been my training fuel partners. So to raise some awareness for the great products that they are, but also too much fasting can impact obviously your hormones, and that's one of the other things I'm really interested to look at the blood work back to see, what are some of the negative sides of doing something this extreme, because of course there are some negative sides of that. But no, generally, and I didn't really feel too hungry throughout. There were certainly times where you do feel a little bit more hungry,
Sure.
but it lasts for a couple of minutes, and then it abates because the body's just in this really nice, yeah, metabolic state.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. That makes perfect sense. I'm glad you answered that way. I think I would answer the same. Like doing workouts in a fasted state. It's weird. You just the energy is just there. You might feel your tummy rumble every now and again, but when you finish, it's not like you have to eat that moment. Like you feel okay, and if it is another hour or two, it's not that big of a deal. So I'm glad you
No,
answered that way.
absolutely. And obviously my shoulders and arms were pretty tired when it got to the end. Don't get me wrong, I was pretty happy to finish, but my legs felt great to the point where I did feel I could, go run a half marathon, and that energy. And again, I didn't really feel tired towards the evening. Obviously, you have the endorphins that come as part of completing a challenge
Sure.
as well, but even the following day, because that kind of no matter what you eat, even though I ate a low carb, dinner still after the event, because I wanted to try and keep things as similar. Your ketone levels. So they got up to, I think I did a Keto Mojo test at the end of the swim. So my ketone levels were up at 5.2
Wow.
millimoles, yeah, per
Wow.
liter. And so then the following day, then, I still had obviously a lot, because the body's kind of, in that state. So I just still had an amazing energy the following day. So, and it just, for me, yeah, I always find whenever my ketone levels are probably like above 1.5, I would say mentally and physically, my body just feels in a very different metabolic state of sharpness, of clarity, of those sorts of things. And that just, I would say, persisted for the 2-3 days, or in general, most of the time my
Yeah.
ketone levels are throughout that. Although I do cycle in small amounts of carbs to help manage, balance the hormones and so forth. And we can get into that a little bit, but yeah, the body just gets into a really nice metabolic
Yeah.
state that probably is aligned to our kind of evolutionary origins of being in that state most of the
Yep.
time.
Yep. And the recovery afterwards as well. Like that night, maybe having like a steak or whatever, you wake up the next day and you might be a little sore or tired, but it's nothing like when you're eating a mixed diet and you're like wrecked for a week. Like you feel relatively good, even though it's such a hard effort.
Yeah, I really agree. And that was interesting balancing the training aspect and the sleep deprivation side of it as well, because it does impact your body's ability to repair itself. So for me, yeah, trying to tease between those two is kind of interesting looking back at the data as well. But no, I agree with you. I think ketones are kind of magical, not only as an energy source, but also, a lot of the kind of the healing properties and the signaling properties that they send, throughout the body. So I do believe that, yeah, they help you recover more quickly, and do less, I would say, kind of damage being in that state than being on a very high carb diet for sure.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about some of the data. You were able to collect more data than I would have assumed you were going to during your swim. So, what data points were you collecting? Obviously, we don't have everything in front of us right now, but you do have some information. I'd love to go over what you think are some of the key points.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So to quickly cover, so the test that I did, so I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor provided by Levels. I did Keto Mojo blood prick glucose and ketone tests, I would say before and after. Very difficult to do it throughout, given, wearing gloves and just trying to do that in a boat. I did have a keto air kind of breath device that almost every hour I took readings on that. And so that measures the acetone levels in the breath, which gives you a signal of effectively the ketones actually being utilized by the body and your muscles. So that was pretty interesting. So, and obviously I had heart rate sensor to look at heart rates. I did the blood tests kind of about 10 days before the morning of the event, the morning following the challenge event, and then about 10 days later to get a reference range. And that was pretty comprehensive cardiometabolic biomarkers as well as hormone biomarkers. And I also did a microbiome test before and afterwards. And so I'm still waiting the majority of those results. I think obviously the CGM data I had instantly, available afterwards. So that was really fascinating. So I posted the screenshot from the Levels app on my website. It's what I expected, but there's a couple of really interesting trends that come out of it that I thought were fascinating. So my average kind of glucose levels were pretty higher than they normally were at the start, I think because of the sleep deprivation. And you always get a small spike in glucose, whenever you start, because the body always tries to utilize glucose first. I think not because it's a preferred fuel source, it's because the body knows that too much glucose is toxic to us. Therefore, it will always try to utilize that first because, you know, glucose is toxic, whereas, none of the other fuel sources that we can are necessarily toxic per se. So you always get a little bit of spike, but when the body realizes there's not much glucose availability, then it starts to switch to ketone production. And so my blood glucose, started on average around kind of 100. I had a spike up to about 100 and I'm just having a look actually to make sure I get the precise data. Yeah, so I had a spike that first hour up to about 132, and then it dropped down back to 100 in that first hour. And then the next 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, it effectively slowly dropped and dropped and dropped down to a level of around 55 milligrams per deciliter, which is, on the low end of what the standard kind of medical world says, very low end of, of what is, healthy. And, some people would say, well, that's starting to become dangerous. One of the purposes of the swim, I think, for me was to prove that even with exercise, like those levels, I don't believe I felt absolutely, great throughout. But the fascinating thing was it literally then for the second 6 hours of the swim, when I was swimming, it locked on literally into that kind of 55. It was almost like on the dot 55, I think 55, 56, 55. The fascinating thing was when I took my water and electrolyte breaks, every 60 minutes we stopped, and I took on water and electrolytes. My glucose levels dropped down to 40, sometimes a little bit lower than 40 during that rest. And then when I started swimming again, they would be straight back up to 55. And then when I would stop, they would drop down to 40 and then would go back up to 55.
Wow.
And so I wasn't really expecting that, but I think it makes sense. I'm still speaking with, a bunch of people in the kind of metabolic health world who are way more educated than me into exactly why this is. But my suspicion is obviously our bodies and organs do need some glucose, the brain and others. And I think in an exercise state, you just need a little bit more, glucose. But what's fascinating is then when you stop exercising, I think the body immediately down regulates, even though the glucose level is very low at 55, the body still down regulates down to 40 because back to the too much glucose in the blood is toxic for us. So I found that amazing if that is the explanation why we're so sensitive to the glucose. Your body will always look to down regulate it where it can, and only provide really the amount that the organs needs. And it stayed totally kind of pretty rock solid throughout the swim until the end. So yeah, that was some really interesting, I think, insights into at least some of the glucose trends.
Wow. It would make sense that the ketones would help protect the body from hypoglycemia when you're talking about numbers that low. I mean, I remember the George Cahill studies when they were fasting people for like 40 days. At the end of the studies, if I'm not mistaken, I believe they dosed these people with insulin, which you would think like that's a terrible idea. You're going to kill somebody with hypoglycemia. And everybody was like walking around like just fine. And I want to say their blood sugar got down into the 20s. And so I think they learned that ketones could be protective against hypoglycemia, even with such low glucose numbers. That is fascinating about their electrolyte drop-offs, though. I think that's fascinating. Were there any other data points that you thought were really interesting, or anything else that you tracked that you thought like really stood out to you?
Yeah, so I think they were the main ones in terms of at least the blood glucose levels. Ketones largely was what I would expect. So I started off, I would say, pretty low. I think this is back to being sleep deprived, and I often find, obviously, when you have a little bit of stress in the body will produce more glucose and less ketones. So my measurement, I think at like 10 past 4 in the morning, was my ketone level was at 0.5 millimole per liter. And as I said, at the end, the keto measure I was up at 5.2. And the keto air readings that I took throughout the swim, I started off at like 6 ppm, and then it ramped up to 22 and eventually up to 33, and then kind of stayed consistent, around that as you would expect. So, and back to your point, and it's back to the body's, because it will happily utilize fat and ketones as a fuel source, and then you just create your body through gluconeogenesis as much glucose as the organs need. And that was the fascinating thing was, it was then the body will upregulate and downregulate that based on whatever it needs. And it's hypersensitive to that, I think in a quite interesting way. So I think they were the main things. The other thing, so literally I just got some of my blood tests back this morning, so I haven't had a full chance to, dive through those. I think the interesting ones that maybe stood out, I'm going to do a write-up and I'll put it on the website and do a video on some of the science behind it once I get the full results. So I'll obviously make sure we link this to the show notes. But obviously my C-reactive protein looks like jumped significantly, obviously the day before and after, which kind of
Sure.
what you would expect after,
Yep.
after putting the body through 12 hours, of constant swimming. I think the fasting insulin, as I mentioned earlier, that was fascinating as well. So, my fasting insulin normally is around 2. That jumped up to 6.5 the morning of the swim. There was only a little bit higher at 8.67, the day afterwards, which again I think is interesting and would make sense. Just I would say given the underlying stress of being sleep deprived, plus just the stress put on the body, from the swim. I still need to look. So testosterone was another thing that I was really interested in, given throughout this swim, I have been working to recover my testosterone levels. I think we covered that in a previous podcast. So it does look like there was a decrease. So my testosterone levels the morning of the swim were at 3.8 for my total testosterone. That dropped to 2.47 the day after the swim. And similarly, my free testosterone was, just looking to find where the was kind of a 0.08, dropped to 0.06. So I found that the total testosterone goes down, which I thought was interesting, but the free testosterone didn't drop maybe as much as I thought it would. So I thought that was interesting, but I really need to deep dive into the
Sure.
into the blood results. But I think they were probably probably the main ones, that stood out in terms of, kind of what's happening in the body metabolically.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. We know your mission. You know what you're trying to do. With this swim, we're trying to show that the body can do this, and we want to get this message out to as many people as possible. Your goal is to reach over 1 billion people. How do you think this message will be carried forward, moving forward from this? Do you think it'll get the attention that it deserves?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I hope so. I am going to do obviously as many podcasts as I can. I'm going to create a short documentary to try and kind of encapsulate, um, what certainly, we and I did metabolically during the swim. And I just hope that it gets as much awareness as possible and just makes people think. It's the main thing I want to really achieve out of this is to people to think, how and where am I getting my energy for? How am I balancing the two energy systems of utilizing fat as a fuel source as well as carbohydrates? And how do I make sure that I've got metabolic flexibility? I'm not over reliant on sugar and carbohydrates, and that you don't need sugar and carbohydrates to fuel athletic endeavor and therefore everyday life. So and certainly the feedback I've got so far is a lot of people thought, oh, okay, well, this sounds a bit crazy, but after seeing it, and they're like, wow, amazing that you actually managed to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope it has as much awareness. I'm sure, have other challenges in the future, which, around a similar theme, kind of metabolism, because I think people just need constant reminders because the current world is very much set against most people in terms of the food, the stress, the kind of a lot of the environment that we live in. So yeah, the more reminders I think people get that we have actually a lot more agency over our own health than we realize, but you do need to be careful, yeah, really what you put in your body to optimize your health and avoid a lot of these chronic diseases. And that's maybe the last thing. I would love your perspective on this, but um, a lot of people only realize this when it's too late. Once you get one of these chronic diseases, which is then it's a lot more difficult to reverse. So I think as a metabolic health community, how do we try and capture people's imagination early to make them think about a lot of this? And I love, for example, a lot of the work that Nick Norwitz is doing. I don't know if you saw his,
Just thinking. Yep.
720 eggs in a month to, yeah, and he calls it legit bait, which is putting things out there which people think are crazy, but doing so really with science and metabolic health in mind. So I think the more awareness through that we can generate, the better, because there is a lot of conflicting information out there. But actually, it can be very simple. Very simple lifestyle interventions can dramatically alter your health, your happiness, and your health span in your life. And so hopefully more people, realize that there's a lot more work to do, but I appreciate all the amazing work that, you and the team in the metabolic health kind of community have really done over the last 10, 15, 20 years. There's a groundswell definitely happening. And so, yeah, more of the message I'm sure will get out there, and hopefully more people take note and start to make small changes that then compound over time.
I couldn't agree more. It really forces the conversation when you do things like this, and you accomplishing this will hopefully strike up a lot of more interesting conversations and bring this to light for people. So I think it's really important. I'm so glad we had this fascinating discussion and got to learn so much about your journey. Congratulations on completing the task. Tell people where they can go to find you, connect with you in your work, and learn all about the swim.
Yeah, of course. So about the swim, so if you go to 02lomond.com, that's the swim website where there's a bunch of information. We're also raising awareness for metabolic health as well as a bunch of different charities. So please check out the donate section, and if you feel like it, donate to one of the great charities around really metabolic health, chronic disease therapy. So yeah, 02lomond.com. The best way to connect with me really is on LinkedIn. So if you search for Neil Gyte on LinkedIn, I am also trying to get on Instagram and some of the other social platforms, but I've not shunned. I just haven't been involved in social media much over the last 10 years, but realizing now how positive it could be. So so Gyte Neil at Instagram. I'm trying to do a little bit more on there. They're the best ways to find me. I also have 1bmh.org, or if you search for 1 billion metabolically healthy, that's really my kind of website and non-profit, which the swim is attached to try and raise awareness for metabolic health and to give people simple tools of where to start. So yeah, they're the best places to find out a little bit more.
Amazing. We will get that all tagged up and make sure that is in there. You deserve a few weeks off, I will tell you. I hope you enjoy some recovery time before you decide to try another challenge in the future. But for now, again, thank you so very much for everything you've done, to have this idea, to have the courage to actually go out and pull it off with all the training and everything that you had to do to make a point that this is possible. And again, to start conversations with people, I think is really, really powerful. So thank you so very much for everything that you do, Neil. And thank you for taking the time to be on our show again today. We really appreciate you.
Well, right back at you. Thank you for all the amazing work that you and team do. Thanks for having me. Love the conversation as always. And yeah, I'm sure I'll be back with some other crazy challenge at some point in the future.
I'm sure you will be, for sure. But for now, thank you so very much for coming on the show again. We really appreciate you.
Perfect. Thanks, Casey.
And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.